Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about stasis theory. Now, this is a way of thinking about argumentation that can work from a sort of diagnostic perspective, but can also work from a planning perspective. So basically, stasis theory is ultimately simplified. It's the idea that there are particular things that must be agreed upon in order for an argument to move forward, right? In order to persuade someone of something, there are particular things that you need to agree on. And there's some variation in how people formulate the questions of stasis theory, but generally there's four points of stasis, or four stasis theory questions. So the first is questions of fact. This deals with sort of what is this issue, right? What's the relevant information? What do we know? What's true about it, etc., etc. Then you have number two, questions of definition. What does this issue mean? Or what are the relevant terms and how do we understand them? Number three is questions of quality. Why does this issue matter? Or why do elements of this issue matter and in what ways? And then four is questions of policy. What should be done about this issue and why? So I had said this works as a diagnostic tool or a planning tool. In terms of diagnostics, what you can do with stasis theories, you can analyze an argument and say, okay, there's a couple of ways you can approach this. One is you can say, all right, what is this argument doing? Is this an argument of fact? Is this an argument of definition, an argument of quality, or an argument of policy? What's the end goal of this argument? And if you figure out what they're trying to do, you can understand how they're approaching it and why they're approaching it in this particular way. So, for instance, if you encounter something that is political fact-checking, for instance, these would be arguments of fact. Here is the truth of this situation. That is the argument that they're making. And so what you have to look at when you're analyzing that or assessing that is say, okay, what evidence have they provided to establish that the thing they're saying is a fact actually is true? The same thing with arguments of definition, arguments of quality, arguments of policy. What do they need? What kind of evidence, what sort of argumentation do they need to provide in order to actually prove the particular thing that they want to prove? So that's one element of the diagnostic side. Another element of the diagnostic side is you can look at complex arguments and say, okay, here's where you're establishing the facts of this argument. Here's where you're establishing definitions. Here's where you're establishing quality. Here's where you're establishing meaning or policy. So you can figure out what are the moving pieces of this, right? And that can be really useful for a rhetorical analysis or evaluation because you can say, all right, I see that you've provided good evidence for the facts of this case, the facts of this issue, but you haven't really defined your terms. And so because different audiences might see X term in different ways, there may not be agreement with the way that you're using this term. You take a term like abstract concepts, especially a term like freedom. What does freedom mean in this particular context? Different people will have different conceptions of what freedom means. If that for one audience means the ability to marry whoever you love, regardless of sex, gender, sexuality, whatever it is, that's one version of freedom. But if another group of people means not being taxed, then the two versions of freedom are not the same thing. And so an argument can break down at these points. this also is this all, and so you can analyze it in that way. Do the points of fact, are the points of fact made compellingly? Are the points of definition made compellingly? Are the points of quality made compellingly? Are the points of policy made compellingly, et cetera, et cetera? And you can understand an argument and assess how well it works for its intended audience based on whether or not each of these points of stasis has been reached. Because you have to convince us to accept the truth of the situation, then you have to convince us to accept the meanings of these terms, convince us to accept the value of them, et cetera, all that stuff. But you can also use this as a planning tool or a brainstorming tool, an idea development tool, right? So if you start thinking about an argument or an issue, preferably an issue rather than starting from the argument you want to make, but if you start thinking about an issue and you say, okay, what are the facts of this issue? And you have to sort of explore them. You have to figure out for yourself, what is the relevant information? And this may involve doing research. What are the meanings of these terms? How do I understand what I'm talking about, and why? How would I convince others to accept that what I mean by these terms is correct, is good, that they should accept what I mean by these terms? Why does this matter? What are the stakes of this? What are the values that underpin my position? This is questions of quality, right? You have to figure out, okay, what do I want related to this issue, and why? Why should I want it? Why should anybody else care about what I'm talking about? And then questions of policy. What do I want done, and why do I think that it would be the best way of going about this? So you have to figure out all of these particular things in order to make a good, compelling argument. And as you are thinking through these different levels of the argument, you have to generate material, you have to figure out ideas, you have to figure out how you would present things in order to convince your audience, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this stuff, this is the sort of planning phase, the generative idea phase, right? Where you're saying, I need to figure out why this matters and to whom, in what ways, et cetera, et cetera. So you figure out all of that stuff. And you go from there, right? That's a good way of thinking through a lot of material in a critical way. It's going to help you build a strong argument out of that thought process. The other thing that's useful in terms of stasis theory, and this corresponds to one of the analytical components I talked about before, is that you can write different types of arguments. You can write an argument of fact, an argument of definition, an argument of quality, an argument of policy, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to figure out what your purpose is in writing. Do you want to convince your audience that they should support a particular course of action? Then you're making a policy argument, right? That is the point of stasis that you need to reach to actually convince them. And that takes different strategies, different techniques, different evidence, etc., than if you're doing, again, an argument of fact. Here is the truth of the situation. Here is what we know to be correct. The arguments, the evidence for that are going to differ from the arguments of policy because they require different qualities of evidence and different things that you have to establish. You can make an argument of fact without establishing questions of definition, without establishing questions of quality, without establishing questions of policy, right? You can say, here is the truth of the world, but you don't necessarily have to say, here's what it means or why it's important. But the further you go along the chain of stasis points, the more of that stuff you have to establish. If you want to make a compelling policy argument, you need to establish that the stuff you're talking about exists, You need to establish what the terms mean, how people should understand what you're talking about. You need to establish why these things matter, and you need to establish what should be done and why. So again, this is a way of breaking up your thinking about the levels of argumentation and how you support an argument or how you analyze an argument to understand what's going on in it.